Je vais commencer par remercier d'abord Caroline, Bernard et aussi toute la communauté de Guinée de nous recevoir ici. Je suis très content d'être là et je crois que c'est très important d'avoir des centres comme cette école ici qui peuvent donner un peu d'orientation dans ce que je considère d'être des temps de désorientation extrême. Il y a plusieurs origines pour ma présentation. Le titre de la présentation s'est changé un tout petit peu. En fait, maintenant, c'est Aesthetic Education and the Pharmacology of the State. Donc, l'éducation esthétique et la pharmacologie de l'État. Je crois que je vais juste aborder en anglais alors. On y va. In a recent article titled Orange Juice, donc jus d'orange, and Agent Orange, literary critic Bruce Robbins wonders whether, this is a quote, there exists a single system that connects orange juice and Agent Orange at a level beyond our comprehension. He takes this question from Don DeLillo's novel Underworld. Quelqu'un de vous a peut-être lu ce texte, c'est un grand tour vraiment par Don DeLillo. Although Robbins clearly has his doubts about the existence of such a system, he still considers the connection it raises between orange juice poured down the throats of children by the representatives of the welfare state and Agent Orange, the defoliant used by the United States during the Vietnam War, a new and urgent topic that raises a number of important questions about one's relation to the state, and in particular, the welfare state, donc l'État-providence, the welfare state. Robbins' article shows that considering the connection between orange juice and Agent Orange means to confront the pharmacology or toxicology, even though it's not the same thing, but Robbins speaks of toxicity of the state. This is a quote from Robbins' article. On the one hand, he writes, horrifying military barbarism against enemy civilians and even towards the state's own veterans, accountability for Agent Orange has by no means been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. And on the other hand, the premise that even in this international context, there was reason to support the state's agency in sheltering its own citizens from the extreme cruelties of the market, to support, that is, the state's real or potential benevolence. So what we have here is Agent Orange on the one hand, horrifying military barbarism, on the one hand, jus d'orange, protection, shelter. The state, Robbins thus points out, can be both poison and cure, Agent Orange and orange juice. From Plato's pharmacy to the pharmacology of the state. Clearly, ce qu'on appelle dans les États-Unis French theory, Jacques Derrida's reading of Plato's Phaedrus can still provide some assistance when it comes to thinking one's relation to the state. C'est clair comme ça, les gens? Ouais, d'accord. In what follows, I pursue further this idea of a pharmacology of the state, in particular with reference to French theory, which Robbins does not consider to be very helpful in the situation he has laid out. En fait, il déteste French theory, il était mon adviseur de thèse, donc c'était très difficile pour moi de travailler avec lui, mais j'ai quand même fini la thèse. Early on in his consideration of the possible connections between orange juice and Agent Orange, Robbins mentions two history books that criticize the welfare state by associating it with fascism. Noting that orange juice literally does mean Agent Orange in these texts, Robbins goes on to link this vision of what he calls a kind of racist totalitarian welfare state to the post-September 11 era, and suggests that it is both strange and not strange at all, this is Robbins' words, that after 9/11, the association of fascism with the welfare state would be flourishing. Donc il parle de la connexion entre le fascisme et l'État-providence. Beaucoup de gens ont fait cette connexion et ils trouvent ça absurde. Robbins, of course, is highly critical of this and takes on, this is his words, those American Foucaultians who, along with many ideas of greater value, also took over their masters, so Foucault's very French anti-statism, end quote. Robbins rejects such a position, stating that, this is another quote, the transnational parallel between France and the United States was always forced. There was clearly no equivalent on this side of the Atlantic, he's writing in America, so in the US, he means, to the centralized, panoptical French state to which Foucault's anti-statism was a philosophical rejoinder. So here we have Robbins criticizing Foucault and followers of Foucault for being against the state and associating the welfare state with fascism. However, what is Foucault's position on the welfare state exactly? And to what extent does it coincide with the representation of it that can be found in Robbins? Donc, qu'est-ce que Foucault dit sur l'État-providence? In a lecture from March 7, 1979, that was part of Foucault's lecture course, The Birth of Biopolitics, Foucault's discussion of the welfare state turns out to be uncannily close to the position that Robbins defends in his article. Je vais alors commencer de citer Foucault en anglais. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas mis les citations en français. J'espère que ça ira. Je suis désolé. Although the course, so Birth of Biopolitics, was supposed to be about biopolitics, Foucault acknowledges at the beginning of the lecture that, quote, things being what they are, I have ended up talking maybe for too long about neoliberalism. Donc il parle du néolibéralisme plutôt que de la biopolitique. Generally considered, this is me adding this, responsible for the deterioration of the state, and in particular, the welfare state. It does not come as a surprise then that in this lecture, Foucault would turn his attention to the welfare state. Donc c'est dans son cours sur le néolibéralisme biopolitique qu'il commence à parler de l'État-providence. What is currently challenged, Foucault observes, is almost always the state. This is 1979. Unlimited growth of the state, its omnipotence, its bureaucratic development, the state with the seeds of fascism it contains, the state's inherent violence beneath its welfare paternalism. In Robbins' terms, Agent Orange operating not just in conjunction with, but underneath orange juice. He goes on to distinguish between two important elements which are fairly constant in this theme of critique of the state. First, Foucault says, the intrinsic power of the state in relation to its object target, civil society. He is referring to what is perceived to be the state's hegemonic power to take over entirely its outside, namely civil society. And then there's a second element that returns again and again in what Foucault refers to as state phobia. And that element is that there is a kinship, a sort of genetic continuity or evolutionary implication between different forms of the state, with the administrative state, the welfare state, the bureaucratic state, the fascist state, and the totalitarian state, all being, in no matter which of the various analyses, the successive branches of one and the same great tree of state control in its continuous and unified expansion.
Donc les gens mettent toutes ces formes de l'État dans le même pot, la même marmite, je ne sais pas comment dire,
le même sac, c'est ça. Foucault arguably lays bare in this passage precisely the conflation that Robbins is also interested in, namely between orange juice and Agent Orange, the welfare state and fascism. Donc il s'adresse à exactement la même conflation, on dit ça en français, les deux qui sont confus, l'État-providence et fascisme. Taking one's cue from Robbins' article and from his criticism of French theory and the American Foucaultians, one would perhaps expect Foucault to side with the anti-statism that he is discussing. But, and I think this is very interesting, this is not what happens in the lecture. Instead, Foucault goes on to harshly criticize the two elements in state phobia that he has mentioned for putting in circulation what he calls an inflationary critical value. The criticism is very powerful, I think it's ce cours et cette session-là est vraiment très impressionnant.
The criticism is very powerful and could be leveled directly against one of the anti-statists that Robbins also criticizes, namely the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. Here's Foucault. As soon as we accept the existence of this continuity or genetic kinship between different forms of the state, so let's say fascism and l'État-providence, and as soon as we attribute a constant evolutionary dynamism to the state, it then becomes possible not only to use different analyses to support each other, but also to refer them back to each other, and so to deprive them of their specificity. For example, he says, an analysis of social security, so this would be the welfare state, and the administrative apparatus on which it rests, ends up, via some slippages and thanks to some plays on words, referring us to the analysis of the concentration camps. This is a reference, you could say, from our perspective, could be read as a reference to Agamben. Agamben does exactly that. In his book, il prend le concentrationnaire, on dit ça en français, comme modèle de la politique moderne. And in the move, Foucault says, from social security to concentration camp, the requisite specificity of analysis is diluted. As Foucault sees it, such inflationary critique allows one to practice what could be called a general disqualification by the worst. Donc on associe toutes les formes de l'État avec le fascisme et comme ça on oublie les effets potentiellement bénéficiaires ou remédiales de l'État-providence. A disqualification of everything by the worst, fascism. It is when Foucault turns to the origins of this critical inflation of the state and neoliberalist discourse from 1930 until 1950 that he ultimately arrives at his own position. The passage, and I will quote it at length, is very powerful and again to me quite surprising. Here's Foucault. Foucault says, well, against this inflationary critique of the state, Foucault says, against this kind of lackness, so the lackness of confusing fascism with the welfare state, confusing Agent Orange with orange juice, I would like to suggest some theses which have been present roughly in what I have already said, but on which I would like to take a bit of a bearing. In the first place is the thesis that the welfare state has neither the same form, of course, nor, it seems to me, the same root or origin as the totalitarian state, as the Nazi, fascist, or Stalinist state. I would also like to suggest, he continues, that the characteristic feature of the state we call totalitarian is far from being the endogenous intensification and extension of the mechanisms of the state. It is not at all the exaltation, but rather a limitation, a reduction, and a subordination of the autonomy of the state, of its specificity and specific functioning. I am saying that we should not delude ourselves by attributing to the state itself a process of becoming fascist, which is actually exogenous and due much more to the state's reduction and dislocation. This passage, ce qui est un passage extrêmement riche, and the way in which it is developed in the course deserves an extended analysis, which I cannot provide here. It would take me too far afield. In the context of this particular argument, I want to take from it one simple point. Foucault is saying that orange juice is not Agent Orange. The welfare state is not fascism. The two have neither the same form nor the same origin. Of course, one can hardly call this a defense of the welfare state, but it certainly does not add up to anti-statism either, as Robbins makes one believe. Whereas Robbins, after De Lillo, appears at least open to considering the pharmacology of the state, the and that might perhaps connect orange juice and Agent Orange, Foucault, this is the interesting thing, appears to brush the possibility of such an and aside, both in terms of the form and the history of fascism and the welfare state. That does not mean, I think, but we might disagree on this, that he is entirely removed from the domain of pharmacology. Indeed, I think pharmacology in Foucault will be located elsewhere, not between orange juice and Agent Orange, but within orange juice itself. Not so much in the state and in laws, but in governmentality and norms. That is, I would argue, what the biopolitical argument amounts to. For Foucault, there thus appears to be, in the larger frame of my argument, no pharmacology of the state, or at least not in the way Robbins sees it. Orange juice, for Foucault, is not Agent Orange. The welfare state is not fascism. Reading Robbins against Foucault then, but not in the way Robbins would have imagined me to, vous voyez qu'il y a un dialogue entre moi et mon ancien prof qui se passe là aussi, I would like to consider further what I have been calling the pharmacology of the state. Donc cette notion que vous trouvez aussi dans mon titre, une pharmacologie de l'État. Qu'est-ce que je veux dire par ça? Up until this point, my use of this phrase, the pharmacology of the state, has been justified by Robbins' association after Don DeLillo of orange juice and Agent Orange, an association that Robbins himself, even though he buys into it a little bit, likens to paranoia, the kind of thing that novelists like Don DeLillo can get away with, but that literary critics or philosophers would want to pause over, at least if they do not want to give in completely to the novel's desire. Yet, DeLillo's suggestion is still powerful enough to make Robbins consider the connection. Indeed, I wonder whether the relation between orange juice and Agent Orange that DeLillo imagined, one that would be beyond our comprehension, as he suggests, does not run deeper than a merely conjectural association that defies all understanding. What if, for example, one were to consider the state in light of Bernard Stiegler's philosophy of techniques, in which pharmacology has come to play a crucial role? Stiegler's recent book on pharmacology, c'est le livre qu'on a déjà mentionné, Ce qui fait que la vie vaut la peine d'être vécue, de la pharmacologie, is begging the question when he introduces in chapter 7 the welfare state as a component in his analysis. Si vous avez lu le livre, vous vous souvenez peut-être que dans le chapitre 7, il parle, Bernard, de l'État-providence dans ce projet sur la pharmacologie. Donc c'est quoi la place de l'État-providence dans cette analyse? Et là, je continue par donner un peu un sommaire de la philosophie de Bernard comme je le vois. Jean-Hugues a fait ça déjà d'une façon plus complète ce matin, mais je répète. In projects such as the multiple volume techniques in time, Stiegler argues that human beings are essentially beings by default. They are essentially prosthetic beings who project themselves into the world through technical extensions or exteriorizations, supplements, if you will. Jean-Hugues a dit ça ce matin aussi, that turn out to be dangerous. Potentially curative on the one hand, they're also potentially empoisoning. And today, in the era of high-tech, we live in a time in which this double pharmacological dimension has reached full swing. As Stiegler discusses in Taking Care of Youth and the Generations, many European and American children appear to be incapable today of focusing their attention on a specific object for longer than a few seconds. This pathology, attention deficit disorder, is directly due to the empoisoning dimension of humanity's technical extensions. Stiegler argues that therefore these pharmacological extensions demand a therapeutics, a practice of care, and it is in this context that he turns to Foucault's late work on the care of the self, about which, as I understand it, we will hear more later on. Il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui va en parler, je crois. Now, when Stiegler introduces the welfare state into this argument, he is not merely asking us to consider the ways in which the welfare state's biopolitics also operates psychopolitically through the norms that are created, reinforced, and passed on through marketing and advertising, for example. He is also asking us to consider, I would argue, the welfare state and the state at large as one of those technical extensions through which the human being projects itself into the world. Such a vision, which one could call, après Derrida, une vision protétatique, donc prothétique et aussi étatique, protétatique. Derrida utilise ce mot dans son cours sur la bête et le souverain. Such a vision opens up a pharmacology of the state, a theory of the state as a pharmacon that, like the other pharmaca that Stiegler discusses, demands a therapeutics or practice of care. If we were to follow Stiegler's path, we could pursue this suggestion through discussion of Foucault's work on the government of the self and of others, how to practice the care for the pharmacon of the state. I think this question is more important than ever in a time when the welfare state appears to be, or the state in general, appears to be more powerful and both more impotent than ever. So now I move to the second section of the article. Donc je vais passer là dans la deuxième partie de l'article où je vais considérer une forme très particulière que ce que j'appelle le soin pour le pharmacone de l'État peut prendre, namely anger. Donc la colère ou la rage peut être le premier mot de l'Iliade de Homère. En grec, ça commence avec le mot menis, rage. Ça, c'est le premier mot. En anglais, ça a été traduit différent, mais anger. Given the ambiguities of the pharmacon, the fact that it can be both poison and cure, it was perhaps to be expected that the care for the state pharmacon would also take on an ambiguous form. Donc, j'essaie de penser ici, c'est un peu bizarre, mais je vais quand même l'essayer, la rage ou la colère comme une forme de soin. Peut-être on a oublié dans le temps dans lequel nous vivons de s'enrager, de devenir fâché, d'entrer dans une colère. Est-ce que la colère peut être une forme de soin? Going back to Foucault's investigation of neoliberalism and the birth of biopolitics, one form of such an angry care for the state that could be discussed here is anger against neoliberalism, generally considered, as I've already said, responsible for the deterioration of the state and the welfare state. But my question is really not just about anger against néolibéralisme. Je crois que c'est très facile de se fâcher contre le néolibéralisme. Ma question c'est quelle est la politique positive qui accompagne cette rage ou cette colère? What kind of positive politics is captured here other than a rage against neoliberalism? The state and the welfare state, perhaps the two most obvious victims of neoliberalism, only rarely factor into this rage. Indeed, such rage often adds up to a largely negatively articulated political vision that, although it gestures towards politics, never quite arrives at actually formulating one. Here, we should no doubt take seriously Isabelle Stengers' recent warning in a chapter from her book Autant des catastrophes, where she discusses the pharmacon, in fact, that to call for resistance, for anger, for colère, for example, is not necessarily the solution and can indeed be part and parcel of pharmacology's curative and poisoning dialectic. I am not suggesting by saying this that we abandon the plea for rage. My question is rather about the absence of the state and the welfare state in the argument against neoliberalism. If we are being asked to rage against neoliberalism's culture of docility, and if neoliberalism is widely considered to be responsible for the destruction of the welfare state, are we also being asked to take up the defense of the welfare state? Is the welfare state the silent beneficiary, parce que très peu de gens en parlent, of the critical testament to rage? In a recent article on Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go, donc je parle d'un autre roman par l'écrivain Kazuo Ishiguro, certains d'entre vous le connaissent sans doute, Never Let Me Go, je ne sais pas comment ça a été traduit en anglais, mais il y a aussi un film qui est sorti récemment du livre. In a recent article on Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go, Bruce Robbins reintroduces the welfare state into the critical plea for rage. Et l'argument est très particulier ici. In the article, Robbins too develops a plea for anger. What is surprising, however, is the way in which this anger relates to the welfare state. In his article, Robbins shows how Ishiguro's novel aligns the welfare state with the culture of docility, amenity, and the effacement of all conflict that can in fact be characterized as neoliberal. So both neoliberalism and the welfare state tend to produce a culture of docility, amenity, effacement of all conflict, in which all we're ultimately required to do is bow one's head with a smile and be flexible, accept what is coming towards us. The welfare state is cast in the novel, Robbins argues, as, this is very interesting, this passage, the institution that bribes us with minor restitutions and supplements so as to divert us from deep and systematic injustice, which is to say, from our legitimate causes for anger. Donc l'État-providence nous donne des petits cadeaux avec la main gauche, la main droite, pour nous divertir des injustices plus fondamentales et pour diffuser, on peut peut-être dire, notre colère. However, within this general framework, the novel, Never Let Me Go, draws attention to the character of Tommy. If you've read the novel or you've seen the film, you will remember this character, who suffers from violent fits of rage. Donc il y a un personnage dans le livre qui il a des attaques de colère. Il commence à s'enrager, et mettre les bras et les jambes et frapper la boue et tout ça. Donc il se met en colère, il ne sait pas vraiment pourquoi. Although Tommy himself is not quite willing to see things in this way, Kathy, the narrator of the novel, considers these fits of anger to be related to a kind of knowledge, to the fact that somehow Tommy always knew that he and his fellow students, here I'm giving away the end of the book or the point of the book, all of them are clones. Tous les étudiants dans le roman sont des clones qui reçoivent une éducation humaniste à l'école, mais en fait qui sont destinés pour donner leur organe à un certain point et mourir. Donc ils sont bred, ils sont poussés pour donner leurs organes à un certain moment. All of them clones, bred to donate their organs to non-clones, are being exploited by a society that claims to care for them, parce qu'ils reçoivent une éducation. And has moreover institutionalized care as part and parcel of this practice of exploitation. Now this is a very grim vision of the welfare state indeed. Soin, welfare, only becomes part of a practice of exploitation of a kind of power game that is being played out. However, by having the reader sympathize with Tommy, Robbins argues, the novel appears to be making the case that, or the case for the expressing of anger, this is Robbins, which is to say, a case in favor of the cruelty that the free expression of anger can cause. Of course, cruelty is bad, Robbins says at the end of his article. This is Robbins again. All things considered, civility would be preferable. But here, in the novel, at least cruelty and incivility also seem to be part of a more expansive and counterintuitive political vision, one that allows us to consider caring here as possibly conflicting with caring there, that allows us to consider the welfare state as a distanced anger-bearing project, in which anger is a necessary part of a genuine concern for people's welfare. Donc j'espère que vous comprenez, parce que c'est essentiel ce qu'il dit là. La colère, anger, la rage, devient, dans une vision comme ça, un élément nécessaire d'une politique de soins. Pour se soigner, pour prendre soin de soi-même, pour prendre soin des autres gens, pour se concerner avec la providence des autres, il faut se mettre en colère parfois. Hein? C'est ça qu'il dit. To a certain extent, the passage makes one consider the argument presented in Orange Juice and Agent Orange, the other article that Robbins wrote that I already cited. Whereas Robbins in that article appears to take it up for the welfare state, against the welfare state's association with fascism, in the article on Ishiguro, it becomes clear that his defense of the welfare state does not add up to some kind of blind embrace of its administrations. Instead, Robbins tries to safeguard a political culture of conflict from what one could call the ideology of care, from the kind of care that risks to become explicit with exploitation, as Ishiguro's novel shows. If the state is thus, as I have suggested, a pharmacon, it appears that this pharmacological essence of the state is intensified with the appearance of the welfare state. As a bio- and psychopolitical entity that explicitly aims to govern our welfare, the welfare state risks to become complicit with neoliberalism's culture of complicity, a culture that in fact contributes to the destruction of welfare and of the politics of conflict altogether. Et c'est pour ça que la colère ou la rage devient nécessaire, according to Robbins. With these reflections on anger, and now I'm moving dans la dernière partie de la présentation, on anger against neoliberalism and the welfare state's cultures of docility, on a caring anger that would be genuinely concerned with people's welfare, and on anger's complicated politics, we have entered into the realm of aesthetics, which I understand here as the realm of sensibility. Pour moi, la question de la colère, c'est une question esthétique, une question de l'aesthesis. In this context, it is worth noting how in the aftermath of the recent riots in London, dont Tania a déjà parlé l'autre jour, in London and also in other cities in the United Kingdom, much of the discussion came to center around this question of anger and how it should be educated. Certains d'entre vous, peut-être vous vous souvenez de ça. Il s'agissait d'une colère et comment est-ce qu'on peut rééduquer ces jeunes gens qui sont en colère, qu'est-ce qu'ils font à être en colère. Rather than considering the riots as an economic issue that is caused by inequality, unemployment, the widening gap between the poor and the rich, those in power chose to consider it as a cultural clash that had nothing to do with the economy. The issue is not inequality, they say, it is that the rioters need to be taught a lesson, need to be taught the ethic of contemporary neoliberal society so that they will no longer destroy but respect the capital that surrounds them. Rather than seizing the riots as a call for the abolishment of deep and systematic injustice, as Robbins puts it, they were seized as an opportunity to call for a re-education of youth. You could summarize it like this. We need, you can imagine Cameron saying this, we need a new Protestant ethic to reinforce the spirit of capitalism. Avec référence à Max Weber, le livre que j'ai lu avec Bernard l'été dernier. One of the things that the discussion in the aftermath of the riots thus made clear is that education, paideia, on a déjà beaucoup parlé de ça, will be at the center of our contemporary relation to neoliberalism and the welfare state. If power, in the aftermath of the riots, becomes interested in such aesthetic education as a way to transform young people's anger into complicity with neoliberalism and the welfare state's culture of docility, into what could also be called consensus politics, it is important to note the critical call for another kind of aesthetic education, in which anger would become part of a politics of dissensus, to recall the work of Jacques Rancière, that would genuinely care about the people's welfare. I'm not saying the London riots are necessarily that, but I'm trying to find an opening there for a more positive politics. With reference to Bernard Stiegler's discussion of nuclear criticism in his book on pharmacology, Ce qui fait que la vie vaut la peine d'être vécue, one could note that Robbins' work shows that such a politics is not a nuclear politics that would blow the welfare state to pieces. Instead, Orange Juice and Agent Orange reveals a strong attachment to the welfare state, bien qu'il faut parfois se mettre en colère contre l'État-providence. I have argued, in fact, that Robbins, as well as some of the other theorists discussed here, urge one to adopt a pharmacological attitude towards the welfare state, an attitude that would enable one to consider not only the state's different guises, donc les différentes formes de l'État, but also the different effective responses, colère, joie, les différentes réponses affectives, that such a plurifaith state may necessitate. Merci.